And you'd put the mirror on top of the record, and as the record would spin, the mirror would show one frame at a time, in essence, because it was reflecting one of the images at a time. So they were very popular. There's a whole series of things. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Toodles, the tugboat, just a whole bunch of things like this. I could actually show these kind of records for an awful long time. And all of these things like Old MacDonald Had a Farm and songs like this were children's records. They were popular with children. This particular series of the Red Raven record series. But they certainly weren't the first to create these animated images. They were popular and entertaining, little kids on Ferris wheels and toy soldiers saluting, all sorts of things like this. But there's a long history of trying to create these animated things, really becoming more popular when Edward Muybridge created his first series. So I actually want to go back a little bit more because there are some interesting things that were created before the modern stuff, which is ultimately what I'd like to talk about. I'll keep the discussion about Red Raven Magic Mirror records to a minimum, and there's actually a whole series of different types of records out there. And to talk about things like this, I feel like I have to talk about Marcel Duchamp for a minute, who was one of the very first people to actually try to create art out of motion, circles and weird things that were just off-centered, and as you would twirl the disc around, it would start to animate. And it's hard to talk about Marcel Duchamp without recognizing one of the record labels that would come later, Vertigo Records, which has a very similar effect as the record would rotate around the spindle. There were also these little toys called phenakistoscopes, which were novelty items that, as you spun them around, would animate a short series of images. Once again, as you would rotate them and look through the little slots, you would see an animation. There are just a ton of these available out there. Monsters, faces would morph, and weird mouths and eyes, and there's this one where this woman is beating this guy with a stick. Another one that has kind of a Greek goddess type person spilling things out. Kind of a Frog and Mr. Toad frog leap thing, and so there's a seemingly endless number of these things, lots of examples online. If you looked around, you'd find something like the Satan with his head being chopped off and endlessly growing back and jumping between top hats, things like that. And there's a lot of labels actually that did these kind of things. There's some Hebrew label, I don't really know anything about it, but it's they've got some good animations. This kid fishing, this character from a story with this big needle walking along with his cap bouncing around behind him. There's an elephant walking behind some palm trees, which is also kind of interesting. There's a kid playing an accordion. There's a train moving along railroad tracks with flowers going by and puffs of smoke coming out of the chimney stack. But they're the same thing. I mean, if you looked at the record straight, it would be backwards. But if you looked at it reflected in a mirror, it would be reflected forward again. And there's one with a clock that demonstrates that pretty well. And then there's a whole series, Calidus discs. I don't know a lot about these. I just happened to find 3 of them being sold once. And it turned out, to me, they seem kind of mildly racist. I don't know how else to say it. In fact, one of them so much so that I'm not even going to include it in this video, but, you know, cowboys and Indians and things like this. Little soldiers marching along. But it's the same effect as the Red Raven movie records. And then there's another series out of Milan, Italy. And I'm not sure, I don't know much about this label either, but again, exact same thing. If you where to rotate these things and animate them. There's a dog eating this snake of sausages. Another kind of this Russian guy dancing, or kind of a dolphin type thing, bouncing a ball with a seal in the foreground, also bouncing a ball. There's one of Pele, which is kind of like the records I just mentioned before, but the animations are nice. Done well. And in fact, I ran across another random thing, Ghost of Maine, I believe it was called, Persistence of Vision, online. I don't know anything about that record. But I'd like to talk about more modern bands, such as Dream End, which is Ryan Graveface's main project from the Graveface record label. There's a really warped one, and the tears washed me, Wave After Cowardly Wave, and there's this guy that's being hung, and I don't know if it's his dying breath or he just hits the bottom of the rope, but it's a morbid, hand-drawn animation, which, if you set it up, you actually would set up a beer glass on top of the record with the little time that you were playing the record. It would be this smooth motion of these little circles, like molecules or atoms vibrating on the record. I also need to mention a Kate Bush record, Running Up That Hill, which was a Record Store Day release from 2013. And if you played it, it actually would play the wrong direction. You wouldn't be able to see it animating. But if you did a simple stop motion animation with it, it would look like one of the Muybridge animations. She's just taken this fish head thing and put it on the person. But the smoothest ones, some of the nicest ones, are actually these records by Bonobo and Sculpture. The Bonobo record is really smooth. If you look at it up close, from a distance, I mean, it animates really well, especially if you take a camera and videotape it at a particular frame rate, 24 I think it is. And then if you look at it up close, there's a guy jumping on a trampoline, a girl running, a person punching in a clock or something, and it's really cool. If you search for the music video online of this, because it's actually really cool. And it's even more unusual than the record, but you can see where all the imagery came from for the record. But this band Sculpture has done a whole bunch of these records. I think the most recent one might be Plastic Infinite, and it does these really smooth animations. There are so many frames that as you're watching it, the little things explode or shrink or circle around the middle of this record. It's really kind of a very smooth animation.